Jazz Dami there with Gime Dasa. It's myself, Manara. Now I'm with you till 12, and tonight we are talking about overnight fame and the effect it has on your mental health. Now, we've been talking to, a few stars tonight, but now I want to get behind, the psychological impact of this, and who better than Elaine Teo, psychologist and life skill trainer and coach. Elaine, welcome to the show.
Hi, Manara.
Hi, thank you so much for joining us tonight. You're live from New York, is that correct?
Indeed, in Williamsburg.
Amazing, thank you so much. Now, we've been talking to, a whole host of stars tonight. I want to talk to you about the scientific aspect of this. Mm-hmm. What effect can overnight fame have on the human mind?
Well, the thing, Manara, is that we have to consider three aspects of fame. Number one, we human beings are pro-social creatures, so we're wired to seek connection. So fame really presses that button, and it's important to understand that aspect of us as human beings. Number two, fame brings power and control and influence, and those are all really important, aspects for us to function successfully and to be able to live a life that gets us kind of what we want. And I think the third one is actually fame is addictive. So I think we look at these three aspects, that we're pro-social creatures, we've got power and, control and influence, and fame itself, has an addictive element to it, because it's based on a transient, 15 seconds of fame, nowadays it is. When you add all those three things up, I think what you have, Manara, is a really toxic cocktail. That you're handing over, to an individual, to be able to kind of say, having overnight fame, it can be incredibly disorienting, incredibly destabilizing. And I think what's the really ugly side of it is that people don't realize there is a real downside to fame, and that is never in the news because it's ugly and it doesn't drive sales, it doesn't drive the headlines, and nobody wants to know about a star that was on X show 3 seasons ago. Who cares?
I know,
so
people have this
really
attitude
cruel
of
side.
Boo-hoo, you asked for it almost, right? There's no sympathy.
Absolutely, no sympathy.
Now,
no
obviously,
sympathy.
The reason we are talking about it in the UK is in the light of a tragic suicide of a contestant who was on a show called Love Island.
That's right.
What can TV shows and, production companies do to prevent depression among contestants who suffer from this?
It's a little bit, ask me that question, and my honest answer is it's almost like asking like a tobacco company, what can you actually do to help people smoke less? I think it's always a mixed bag, isn't it? Because clearly, or like, sometimes you're in the tube or whatever and you see like these, sites that promote, gambling or speculating on whatever, and there's a little fine print at the bottom saying, please gamble responsibly. As a psychologist, Manara, that irks me because I think there's very much a sense of taking advantage of certain ways in which we are wired, and to actually say that please do this responsibly, or please manage this so that you don't get too depressed. I'm not saying it's not important. I'm not saying that there can't be work that can be done. There is I think scope for more education and more support. But on the other hand, I think if we really were to strip this back down to its commercial bones, at the end of the day, as a revenue-making entity, as a revenue-making vehicle, that's why reality shows are so popular, because they're incredibly lucrative, and they're incredibly lucrative because they really grab everyone's attention.
And also, do you find that, when people become, more established, they get a manager, and what often happens as you become more famous, that manager is pushing you in directions that you might not want to go, so you end up becoming a product.
Yes, you are. And I think I will almost say the onus is on the individual, to really think carefully as much as they can and realize how much we're all being manipulated. Okay, we're all being inundated by messaging. I talked about tube ads, but you've got, TV shows. You're going to dinner and you're having a drink at a pub and your friends are talking about, something. So we are constantly under messaging that tells us only the positive side of fame and doesn't really kind of flag out the fallout.
Do you think that
what
also
happens when that goes sour?
Now, for famous people as well, they have a direct line into people's opinions, which often can be very negative.
Yes.
Whereas before, you could just ignore it, or you wouldn't hear from it, or you'd read a letter in a magazine about you.
Exactly. And I think that's the danger with smartphone technology and with streaming services. It is in our lives, everywhere. It's almost impossible to escape. And I think if you look at Twitter, I'm old enough to remember when Twitter first came onto the scene, and why I didn't, really partake in Twitter was just because I felt overwhelmed. There's just so much. And, suddenly, you find yourself getting hooked. You're like, wow, fame used to be that, you would see someone like, I don't know, Lionel Richie, or Diana Ross or whatever, or ABBA, and they're on stage and they're really far away.
But now they're tweeting their day-to-day life and having fights with trolls.
You can follow them, and that gives you this fake feeling of being very close to this celebrity. So it's incredibly intoxicating, and I think that desire to then be famous is being able to participate, in this toxic combination, this intoxicating combination of power, control, influence, visibility, plus the fact they are pro-social and the addictive quality of it. It is a very, very difficult thing, which is why, going back to what you're saying, what can TV companies do about it? I think they ought to take a good hard look at themselves, to be perfectly honest, and understand that what they're peddling in a way is no different than a drug. And are they being responsible, and are they really stopping and thinking and following up and, finding out on the impact, or are they just kind of turning a blind eye thinking, well, that's their problem, because that's disingenuous. At the end of the day, it is the platform on which they stand to benefit. They've created a format, and they jolly well know that the people who are signing up to take part in these shows do not have a full understanding, because they're just everyday people. They don't know what the showbiz life is like. They don't know. Speaking
clinically, what would you say is the most common diagnosis for celebrity psychologist patients?
This is something that the science itself doesn't have an easy answer. I think if you have a look at the research that's available, there is no conclusive evidence that points to a specific diagnosis and says, it is this disorder or it is that disorder, because fame in itself is a multifaceted phenomenon. There's a social element to it, there's the power element to it, and there is the pleasure element of it. And if you look at pleasure, there is, what we call hedonic pleasure, which is short-term pleasure, and there is, more sort of ongoing pleasure, which is things like contentment, which is wired very differently. So if you look at something like short-term pleasure, it turns out that fame, may have very similar neural activation patterns with other things like, say, good company, food, and other forms of pleasure, that there seems to be at the moment now in the research this thing called a common currency, that drives how pleasure works in the brain. Long story short, there isn't an easy diagnosis for that, because people seek fame for different reasons.
Well, and I think what advice do you give to any you're a life skills trainer and a coach as well?
Yes.
How should someone mentally prepare themselves, or what's a healthy coping mechanism, when dealing with the downsides of fame and how overwhelming it can be?
I think the first thing is to prepare yourself well before you go on the first place, and not to mistake fame as the end. It's a means to an end. And I think when we stop and think about how fame could be really helpful. And there are lots of celebrities out there who are using their fame, to really push some really worthwhile causes. And arguably, people like, Ellen, for example, or Oprah, who use their platforms, to really bring up, some really worthwhile things. I think fame is not something to just toss out, at the bathwater and say, it's better to have no fame at all.
But don't you think it's also because it's so, the technology has changed so quick in the last 2 years, let alone the last 10.
Yes.
Do you not think that there must, you're going to be speaking to a lot of people in a few years' time who weren't prepared for it, who didn't even aim to, maybe they didn't even know they were going to become famous, because you know how viral success happens.
Indeed. And I think the key thing to understand is that it can happen exactly like you said, Manara, kind of overnight. And what you have to understand is that there will come a point in time where it dies down. As long as you can keep a steady keel and keep your head around you, as a famous poem by Rudyard Kipling says, if you can keep your head all about you are losing theirs, and I think that is why I trained to be a meditation teacher, because I find a mindfulness and a meditation and also other forms of maintaining, emotional well-being, like yoga, for example, those are really effective ways in which you can keep control of your conscious experience. So even if that intoxication comes, you're not totally swept away by it, and you can watch yourself carefully as you start to get seduced.
I find it really interesting you call it intoxication, because that's what happens. You get a come down.
You do. And withdrawal symptoms, so for us in psychology, there's, when we look at happiness, and you get that with the great, religious and spiritual practices as well, there is short-term pleasure, which you get when you eat a chocolate cake, or you have a great drink, or you go out with friends. These are what we call stimulus-driven pleasure. Now, the problem with when we look at happiness in our society, pretty much every single messaging that we get, is overwhelmingly about stimulus-driven pleasure. But Manara, there's one very basic problem with stimulus-driven pleasure, which is when you take the stimulus away, the pleasure is gone. Mm-hmm. So what do? You go and seek more of it, and you're hooked. You're hooked. And it doesn't matter whether you're hooked on, say, the company of friends, or whether you're hooked on status and power. Or it doesn't matter, as long as it's stimulus driven by something. And in this case, fame's one of the most powerful and, in a sense, dangerous stimuli, because it's so intoxicating. When that thing goes, you find yourself down. Now, and then what you do, go and seek a new hit.
On a micro level, right? Let me just ask you about myself. I DJ. Sure. And the bigger I get, the more people demand visibility, right? They want photos, maybe they want you to work with a brand, and you have to put yourself out of your comfort zone and stop complaining. Yes. What advice would you give me to mentally prepare for success?
Manara, are you happy with, do you ask yourself, do you check in with yourself periodically, if you're happy with how things are going? I think that's a very simple and easy thing that yourself can do, or anybody who finds themselves, hidden, by these sudden spikes of fame can do for themselves. And this also applies to people who get very successful in corporate life, because, as a corporate trainer, I deal a lot with senior executives, and you'll be surprised, but that is actually why retirement coaching is a big thing. Because, I have these really powerful executives, you can imagine, who overnight, they become OAPs, they're taking the bus, like everybody else. All that status, all that power is gone. And it can be crippling. Your sense of power, your sense of status, your sense of visibility, your identity is gone. So,
but also it's hard to take a step back when it's your income.
It is.
Do you know what I mean?
Is.
Now,
exactly.
So much visibility is what generates income, actually, especially in music world.
Yes.
So, what you're saying is great, but it's hard to take a step back.
It is, isn't it? I think then I'll tell you what you can do. You can really stop and invite yourself to think about what enough looks like for you. What does good enough look like? Because I'll tell you one thing, if left alone to our own devices, we'll be asked to consume more and more and more and more, and it doesn't end. We're in a consumerist society, aren't we? Is there ever going to be a brand that's going to say, oh, you know what, you bought enough trainers, or you bought enough
Never. No, the world is ruthless, and at the end of the day, it's all about money. Yes. But do you think maybe, you've probably, I don't know, how long have you been a psychologist? Let me ask you that first.
Oh, you know what? I trained 20, so I graduated from Oxford in 99, so it's been 20
the world
years.
Has changed a lot.
Big time.
With social media, it's like we straight away are injecting ourselves with these information, with these images. How do you tell people not to pay too much attention to that and not get overwhelmed by it? Or is meditation the answer, like you mentioned?
I think meditation is so powerful, and I think there are lots of apps, lots of ways in which you can try it, and I'll tell you why. Because when I started meditating on a daily basis about 2 years ago, and last year I just finished graduating from the British School of Meditation, we learned some very basic things about how the mind works. So one of the things that shook my world, Manara, was this. Your mind, you are not your thoughts, and you are not your emotions. Thoughts and emotions, they are by nature temporary. Meaning to say, if you wait, they will go away on their own. That's the first mind-blowing thing. The second mind-blowing thing is then to say, okay, so that means that if we are upset about something, it's because we're holding on to them. Wow, if you go nowhere else, and you stop and you think about fame, and you think about how much you are unwittingly contributing to one's own being hooked, because you are feeding that energy, you're feeding it that attention, and you're holding on to it. But the moment you realize, oh, that's not how the mind works, I can actually just get down and rest, and various forms of working with the mind, meditation be a great one, mindfulness is a form of meditation, as I mentioned, yoga, different kinds of sport as well, give you quite a meditative experience. There are all various ways in which you can just watch. But I find meditation the most direct one, because it teaches you to just watch what's going on in your own mind. And when I teach this, I call it the theater of the mind.
I'm gonna have to download one of them apps to get into meditation. But then it's still your phone. So it's like, how do you not look at the text message that pops up while you're meditating?
Oh, it's easy, because you see, in meditating, what you do, Manara, is you're not, when I started like psychology and stuff 20 years ago, meditation was misconstrued. It was like, oh, you're going to empty your mind. No, nowadays, that's not what it is. It's about being aware of what's going on in you. And I'll tell you one thing. It actually increases my quality of life. Why? Because I slow down. And when I'm really eating something, I really enjoy every bite. And because, my journey is quite recent, I can remember the time where I was just stuffing down the chocolate biscuit or whatever, right? And you're already reaching for the next one. And I'm sure you can, lots of listeners can chime in with the experience. You've vacuumed out the whole pack of chocolate digestives or whatever. You haven't even really tasted one.
Yeah.
So ironically, meditation, I find, delivers a lot of that satisfaction and that contentment and that pleasure. It isn't just about turning into a monk. I enjoy my food, I enjoy my wine, I enjoy a great movie, and I enjoy the company of friends.
Can you see why you must be able to see then why some celebrities do want to do the whole, like you said, become a monk and just be like, you know what, screw this, I'm gonna like Dave Chappelle when he moved to South Africa and was like, I'm not down. It's like it's very dramatic. But you can see why people do it.
Oh, totally.
It's the only way to escape.
You're stuck with your fame. And you can't escape it. It's like what you said just now. I was reading an article online, with a piece of research, and they were like saying, imagine if you wanted to go to Sainsbury's. I was thinking about, what happens if one of the royals wants to go to the supermarket in their tracksuit. They can never go to the supermarket in a tracksuit again without someone recognizing them, without people, fame warps how people interact with you. And in today's world, you talked about social media, that's now permanent.
But don't you think it's also on a micro level now, where like regular people who aren't even famous but may have 5,000-6,000 followers, even they don't want to go to the supermarket without makeup on?
Yes. I had a friend from Boston sit in my living room, a couple of months ago, and they're telling me about Billie Eilish. He has a 16-year-old daughter, and I had no idea who Billie Eilish is. Do you know who Billie Eilish is?
No, am I supposed to know who that is?
She's like this. No, she's like this, really famous. I think she's 16 or 17, and she is a mega star. She's one of those newfangled, pop phenomena, and she writes about songs like saying, copycat, and you want to be me, don't try and be me, you have to be yourself. But then she has another song saying, I don't want to be me. Now, I'm passionate about life skills for young people, and I'm really concerned about young people's emotional well-being. I've got 3 kids of my own, and to actually know that this is the kind of messaging that young people are consuming and aping and wanting to be, and it's so mixed up. On the one hand, you're the celeb who's saying, you want to be me, suck it up, whatever. But then on the other hand, she's saying, I hate myself. What are you supposed to
But I'm
believe?
guessing the psychological impact of that kind of success on a younger brain is even worse, because you're still developing.
Even worse. Oh dear God, even worse. And that's actually why it really gets me going, because I've talked in the previous episodes of the show before about the maturation of the prefrontal cortex, and that only matures, and that's the stuff where your executive judgment and your ability to delay gratification and be self-disciplined and to rise above the temptations of things, that only matures in the late 20s. So if you're looking at the fact that a 10-year-old, my 10-year-old and my 12-year-old have been, politely asking mum for a phone, and I have actually held it back from them because I know too well the dangers of being sucked in.
Yeah, that's what I want to ask you about. Now, given your experience and your knowledge and seeing, people I'm sure that have needed building up and repairing, would you ever enjoy being famous? If someone said to you, there's a switch you can press, Elaine, and you can be famous, would you say yeah?
Oh, I would hesitate. I would really, really, really hesitate, because it is such a poison chalice, and the effects go way beyond one's control. I find that sobering, because you are, as you said, with visibility and stuff, you're no longer your own property. You're not even master of your own universe anymore.
You're projected image.
You are thrown out there, and people will pass judgment on you. They will make their own interpretations of you. And for me, I have a healthy sense of self and who I am. But if you want me to go out there and be gossip fodder for 3 million people, I hardly know.
You're
and
not
they're
down.
My personal. No, thank you.
Elaine, look, thank you so much for joining us. Before we leave you, I just want to ask, as a life coach, what advice would you give to anyone who thinks that, maybe as a listener that thinks they really want to be famous and they see fame as the main signifier of success and satisfaction? What would you say to them?
I say don't be fooled. Do not be fooled. It is the wrong path to what you seek. And it doesn't matter what it is that you're seeking. People seek fame for some reason. Some seek it because they want to be liked. Some seek it because they want to be powerful. Those are all worthwhile things, because we can want to be powerful for good reasons as well. We want to be liked because it's pro-social. I mean, examine those factors directly,
Elaine,
and nurture those connections.
Thank you so much for joining us today. It's been really insightful for myself as well, I'm sure for a lot of our listeners. That's Elaine Teo, psychologist and life skills trainer and coach. Tonight we've been talking about overnight success and the effect it has on mental health.